Even your best friends won't tell you. This is the advertising slogan which years ago sent Americans scurrying to the drugstores to purchase a product which was guaranteed to cure us of that malady, supposedly responsible for our losing friends and our alienating people. But the slogan, "Your best friends won't tell you," does not apply to every offensive area of life. And so it is that there come those days when what our friends think are borne to us on the vehicles of words. And then, of course, it is that we become ruffled, resentful, and sometimes retaliatory. This, of course, is because of the very temperament of our natures. So much of the divine and so much of the common in us, that somehow or other, when we find ourselves stroked by praise, we purr with appreciation and draw lovingly near. But the moment we find ourselves slapped by criticism, we yelp and jump apart and find ourselves vehemently on the defensive. And it was this very typical reaction to criticism which the Apostle Paul encountered in the Galatians. Two things, you remember, were occurring in the Galatian church. One was that the apostleship of Paul was being disputed and discredited. The second trouble in the Galatian church was this, that there were members of that Christian church who believed that only Christians, or rather only Jews, could become Christians. And therefore they were teaching that if a Gentile was to become a Christian, he first of all must submit to circumcision, and then secondly he must take upon himself the total and the complete burden of the Jewish law. And so it was that Paul writes to do two things. First of all, to affirm the certainty of his apostleship, and to tell his readers that he himself was called by God. And then secondly, he writes to correct the errant gospel which they have been preaching, and to declare once more to them that salvation comes not through man's works, but as the gift of God, and it is man's possession by faith. And then it is that having presented the problem to the Galatians, Paul, in the 16th verse of that 4th chapter, asks the searching question, "Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth?" Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? And is not this a pertinent question for both pulpit and pew in the wake of events which were spawned in the troubled waters of last Sunday? The truth as I saw it was disclosed last Sunday. The truth as you saw it was disclosed to me during the week, either by conversation or by communication. And so, we find ourselves face to face with the very thing that Paul faced. In the midst of criticism, the question, am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? How then shall we properly evaluate this question in order that we might avoid enmity and hostility, and in their place secure amicability and comity? Well, it seems to me that before we ask this searching question, or before we answer this searching question which Paul through the Galatians puts to you and puts to me, we must ask 4 other questions. The first question is this: did the adverse judgment have its origin in friends or enemies? Did the adverse judgment have its origin in friends or enemies? Antisthenes, you remember, who was a disciple of Socrates and lived about 300 BC and was one of the founders of the Cynic school of philosophy, said, you remember, on one occasion, there are only 2 people who can tell the truth about yourself. One is an enemy who has lost his temper, or a friend who loves you dearly. Only 2 people who can tell the truth about ourselves. One, an enemy who has lost his temper, or a friend who loves you dearly. Now, Paul, in this letter to the Galatians, makes it amply evident that he is writing as a friend to friends. Paul had an unusual first association with the Galatians. He was on one of his missionary journeys and evidently became suddenly ill with some difficult malady. It was a malady which only made Paul in physical appearance more reprehensible than he was. And probably because of the situation of Galatia and the nature of his ailment, Paul came to Galatia. And you remember of his reception there, he writes in words that were read this morning, "You did not look on me with contempt, or turn from me with loathing, but you received me as if I were an angel from God. Yea, you received me as you would have received Jesus Christ himself." So Paul says, you were my friends from the moment I found myself by circumstance in your community. And then later in that same chapter he adds, and you would have dug out your own eyes and given them to me. This would indicate that Paul's affliction somehow or other had something to do with his eyes. And he said, you loved me so much, your friendship so strong, that your own eyes you would have dug out and given them to me, if at all possible. Paul says this was your love for me. And then he tells them of his love for them by using an expression that is repeated nowhere else in any of Paul's epistles. He speaks of them with the phrase, my little children. And the very phrase itself transports to our minds something of the love and the care and the concern that Paul had for these people at Galatia. So here we have friend against friend. and the criticism coming from those friends. Well, what shall we say of that? Have I any reason to suspect your friendship? Not ever. No people could have been to the family or to myself more gracious and considerate from that first day in January 1958, when the providence of God brought us to this place. Not once have you ever given us any reason to suspect that you were anything but friends. And I hope, though I'm sure the evidence has not been as ample, that you have no reason to suspicion our friendship for you. So then, we ask ourselves, does the criticism, does the adverse judgment have its origin in friends or in enemies? Truly, I can but say in friends. And if that be so, shall we not then say, as did the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, where you remember, or rather not Paul, but Proverbs writes, what faithful are the wounds of a friend. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. But in the second place, we must also ask ourselves this: how extensive is the criticism? How extensive? We've asked ourselves, did it originate in friend or enemy? Now we ask ourselves, how extensive is it? Is not this one reason why criticism so, as it were, wilts and disintegrates us? That when we are criticized, we feel that all of life has come under adverse judgment. When in reality, when we are criticized, ordinarily it is but a wee, small, tiny portion of us. Yet we lose sight of that truth. And when criticized, we act as if somehow or other life had become just utterly impossible and fruitless and useless for us. We look at ourselves and ask if there's anything worthwhile in us or about us. But remember, it was only one small segment. Have I ever criticized our sense of stewardship? Not once to my knowledge. For I rejoice in the stewardship witness of this church. Have I ever impugned the leadership of this church? Not once has there ever been occasion for me to stand in this pulpit and say one desultory thing against one elder or deacon in this church. Have I ever denounced our overall interest in the work of our General Assembly? Never, because there was no reason. So here we find ourselves, as it were, torn apart, because criticism of one small segment of the church's life. Our attitude towards public affairs. But here let me issue this word of warning to you and to myself. We must never be such a church that glories in its accomplishment to the extent that it feels it has the right to ignore some of its responsibilities. And this is always the danger. We can rejoice in what we do and ignore other tasks that we know we ought to do. You remember how plain this truth Christ made on the day when there came to him the rich young ruler who sought discipleship with Christ. And Christ, you remember, asked him, do not commit adultery, do not kill, do not steal, do not bear false witness, honor thy father and thy mother. And proudly the young man said, all these have I kept from my youth up. And one would have thought that then there would have come the words of Jesus, come, follow me. For where would Christ ever find a man of impeccable morality such as this? But was that sufficient? No. Christ said, one thing thou lackest. Go sell what thou hast and give to the poor, and then come follow me. One thing. This one thing the man refused to do, and the door of discipleship was closed. It made no difference to the mind of Christ how wonderful his other attributes. One thing missing. And this one thing prevented him from becoming an apostle. Remember, James says almost the same thing in his epistle. For whosoever shall keep the law and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. Yes, we have much about which to rejoice and give thanks. And remember, the criticism concerned only one small segment of our corporate life. But let us remember, too, that Jesus said, one thing thou lackest before acceptability. And the third question we must ask ourselves is this, of course. Is it true? Is the adverse judgment justified? Is what is said about you and about me really true? Epictetus, you remember, one of the very early Greek philosophers of the early Christian period, said, if anyone speaks ill of thee, consider first whether he had the truth on his side. If anyone speaks ill of thee, consider first whether he hath the truth on his side. And yet this is the last of all questions that we ever ask when we find ourselves condemned and denounced. Why? Because at the first word of criticism, at the first speaking of adverse judgment, the reaction is what? That the mind then becomes busy seeking and searching for alibis with which to counteract what we believe is something unjust. And after the seething has settled, then perhaps we begin to ask ourselves the all-important question, is this criticism true? If true, then what? Then we can but accept it and go on. And it takes a great deal of Christian grace on your part and mine, doesn't it? I read the other day when Abraham Lincoln was president, that one day it was related to him that Stanton, his Secretary of War in his cabinet, had called him a fool. And Abraham Lincoln, you remember, in reply said, Stanton is a wise man. If he said, I am a fool, I had better look into the matter. And this, mind you, from a man whose Christianity has always been questioned. And yet here is the first step that any Christian ever takes in the matter of criticism. Being honest enough to find out and ask ourselves, is it true? If it isn't true, then like Christ we can go our way. For that paragon of virtue, that exemplar of living, had his critics also. But he knew that no word of criticism ever was based on truth, and he could go his way. But we are no Christs. Frequently what is said is true. This we must admit. Shall we not then accept it in that spirit of 1 Corinthians 13, where we are told, love rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth. Whether the truth be about you, or whether the truth be about me. And finally, one more question that we must ask. Whose judgment matters most? Whose judgment matters most? In 1 Corinthians 4, the Apostle Paul says that every man is subject to three judges. The judge first of other people. Secondly, the judgment that we give upon ourselves. And thirdly, the judgment of God. Now, Paul, for some strange reason, treats lightly here the judgment of others and the judgment of self. I doubt if he would do so today. But he places great emphasis upon the judgment of God. Why? Because God and God alone knows a man's motives and understands a man's circumstances. Therefore, Paul says he, and he alone, is in a position to judge. And this is always the satisfaction that must be yours and that must be mine, is that God is the judge who matters most of all. When Hugh Latimer, one of the first martyrs of the Protestant Reformation in England, was in his heyday preacher to King Henry VIII, he relates in one of his books that one Sunday morning, as he prepared for worship service with the king in the king's chapel, he heard as it were a voice saying to him, Henry, or Latimer, be careful what you preach, for you go today to preach before the King of England. But a few minutes later there came, he said, another voice which said, Latimer, be careful what you preach today, for you are going to preach before the King of Kings. And isn't this always true? And is not He the most important judge of all? It would be fine for a minister ever to remember that he stands on a Sunday morning to preach before the church family of the First Presbyterian Church of Raleigh, but he preaches before a higher court and a greater body even than that. He preaches before the King of Kings, who is the only one and worthy judge of all of us. So Paul's question comes again. Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? And I have suggested that we shall answer it only in the framework of the answer that we give to four other questions. The first one, does this adverse judgment have its origin in friend or enemy? If in friend, then shall we not believe that faithful or honest, as the word literally means, honest are the wounds of a friend? Shall we not also ask ourselves how large a segment of our corporate life was criticized? Only a very small part. Yet let us remember those words of caution voiced by Christ when He said to a man who had so much on his side, one thing thou lackest. And that one thing kept him from discipleship. Shall not we also ask, is the criticism true? If it is, shall not we then say with Paul, love rejoiceth not in iniquity, but real love does rejoice in the truth? Shall we not also ask, who is the judge that matters most? My judgment of you, or your judgment of me, important as they are, but more important still, the judgment of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Have we become enemies because we told each other the truth? Have we? Have we? Our Heavenly Father, grant that when the sizzle in our lives begins to settle, that we then honestly shall confront that searching question which Paul first delivered to the Galatians. And grant us, our Father, perfect honesty. For only in honesty shall we work and prosper in thy kingdom. And now unto him who alone is able to keep us from falling, to present us faultless before his presence with exceeding joy, the only wise God, our Savior and Lord, be honor and glory, dominion and power, now and evermore.